Welcome to Social Work Live at Columbia School of Social Work. My name is Michael Friedman. I am your host. Each week we interview a member of the Columbia community who's doing some interesting work in the field, and we spend about 15 minutes chatting, and then we move on to your questions. You can enter your questions in the comments section, and as you do that, somebody will pick them up and eventually pass them on to us. This week we have with us a fascinating person, Desmond Patton, who has been doing work which I think is really interesting on social media and gang-involved youth and how these things connect. How did you get involved in all of this?
Yeah, so it's really great to be with you this afternoon. Thank you. I started this work back in Chicago. I did my PhD in Chicago, and I had been working with young people who were working to navigate violence in their community. So I was following a group of 20 high-achieving young black boys in Chicago, and they alerted me to how they would use social media to identify safe and unsafe locations in their community. And then they kind of alerted me to some interactions that were happening on Twitter. So, for example, there were two rappers that were from Chicago that were going back and forth on Twitter. One was a more well-known rapper, the other one was lesser known, but they were both from also affiliated with rival gangs on the south side of the city. And the lesser-known rapper, I guess, got fed up with the communication going back and forth, and then he decided to identify his location on Twitter and said, if you want to solve this problem, let's meet in this location. And then within 3 hours, he was shot and killed in that exact location that he posted on Twitter just 3 hours before. So I became really curious and interested in the role of social media in violence generally.
It's really interesting. I must say I'm an old man, as you can tell. And so before I was looking at your material, I wasn't thinking about gang-involved youth using social media to communicate.
Yeah.
So it's quite fascinating.
Thank you.
That's happening.
Thank you.
And I know that early on in working on this, you came across a young woman who portrayed herself, at least, as a killer.
Yeah.
That was the expression hitter.
Yeah.
Online, and you looked into some of that?
So for the past 5 years, I've been studying and observing a young woman named Kyra Barnes. I found out about her story through a UK media outlet back in 2014, and it came crashing across my screen, right? The gun-toting gang girl of Chicago. And, at the time, I was a junior faculty member, and I was really interested in that next big research study. And Kyra's story really was unique in that she was a young woman that was known as a shooter or a hitter in her gang on the south side of the city, which meant that she was responsible for either shooting or killing individuals that were rivals to that gang, or the opposition, if you will. And that positionality was unique for young women. It's not unique for women to be a part of gangs, but to have that level of responsibility was really new. And then what I thought was interesting about the news article is that they listed her Twitter handle, which I didn't really see in news articles when they would describe a violent event. And so her Twitter handle was Taekwon Assassin. So, of course, that provocative handle was of interest to me. And so I started the work really trying to understand, what might Kyra be able to tell us about root causes of violence? Could we see any traces of communication on her profile that might indicate future violence? And what might it tell us around how other young people in her community are using this platform as well? And initially, I would say that I was probably pursuing the wrong research question. I initially was only interested in violent and threatening communication. So I dehumanized her immediately. I only saw her as this object, this subject to be studied, and only looking at this violent communication. But what she did for me through her tweets, through her images, has allowed me to see her as a young girl, as a child, is a person that experienced trauma and pain. And so through exploring, kind of like an archaeologist digging, looking through these tweets for years, looking at the language, looking at the pictures, looking at the text, and then talking with community members who were from the same community as Kyra to really understand the nuance and culture in those posts, we really got to see a more robust and full person.
One of the things that you noted in that situation was that she was suffering from fairly significant grief.
Absolutely.
And that she expressed her grief and her sadness and her sense of loss in her Twitter account, and then went on to say things that were angry, potentially violent, probably resulted in violence. So I wonder if you can just comment some.
Yeah.
Is this a fairly typical pattern now of people suffering from grief and then moving on to violent activity?
Yeah, so one of the things I think was really complicated about this research is that we would see these posts that we weren't really sure if they were aggressive or grief. Mm-hmm. And so a part of the challenge is making sure that we could accurately interpret a post. And so we would see things that may be a rap lyric or may use tough language. But when we would talk with the community members and people that knew Kyra, we would better understand that these were actually posts around loss and grief. And then we studied it at the aggregate level. And so we did some qualitative and quantitative analysis to see, is there any pattern between grief posts and more aggressive posts? And what we saw is two things. Number one, that grief and aggression were not randomly distributed in our Twitter data set, meaning these were intentional things that were being communicated in the Twitter profiles, and that there was a 2-day window between posts that exemplified loss and grief and then aggression. And so across a large corpus of Twitter posts, not just Kyra, but people that she was connected with, we saw this pattern happening over and over again.
So that suggests that if you can see the expressions of grief and maybe the beginning expressions of something aggressive or violent, that maybe it's possible to intervene with people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there is a missed opportunity to leverage the full narratives that people bring to social media as a way of intervening in some of the tough spots in their life. And so what we're trying to do in the Safe Lab is to work with communities and work with young people to develop a set of interventions that are technology based so that they can really think about their digital use to get support on the things that they're bringing to social media in real time as well. So we're working to develop an app so that social workers and mental health practitioners can tap into these communications and support young people. And we're also creating some technology tools so that young people can think and practice different ways of being online and to consider that footprint as well.
So when you say that social workers will have a tool to work with their young clients on this, that sounds to me as if these are young people who are already part of a caseload, as it were. Is that the case? Are these kids that are known to social workers that you're working with? Or is there some way also to connect with kids who are just out there?
Well, I think both and. So I've had conversations with several great violence prevention organizations throughout the country where they have catchment areas and groups of young people that they are interacting with both off and online, and they are following them on social media. They are consenting with them to be able to follow them on social media.
So they are getting consent.
They are getting consent. However, from a research perspective, what we've learned is that if some person has signed up for, in particular, Twitter, that we don't need consent necessarily to observe their interactions online. However, in the Safe Lab, we take this very seriously, and so we go through an institutional review board process, and we also do community consent. So when we can't get consent from a young person, which of course makes sense, a 17-year-old is not going to want to give a Columbia professor a consent, we will then go back to the community, talk to them about our research and what we've learned, and ask them, how should we talk about this work? What things should we show and should not show? How should we disseminate this work? So we ask and look for community level consent as well.
I'm not sure I'm clear about what community level consent would be. So,
Yeah.
Again, I'm an old man.
Yeah.
And, 1984 used to be in the future for me. And so, I have a kind of, many people my age have a sort of visceral reaction to the amount of information that's available on social media, which personally I avoid using as much as possible for that reason. But so you talk to the community, and the community says what?
So here's the challenge, right? And so we spend a lot of time trying to get consent from young people. Right. So we would direct message them, email them, and ask them, are you okay with us using your Twitter communication for our research purposes? Now, that's not something that we necessarily had to do, but we wanted to do that. And 0 people would respond to those requests, right? But then we would also see these really critical posts of people crying out for help and talking about death and pain and trauma. And so we also felt this responsibility to do something with that data. So in absence of being able to get that direct consent from an individual, we would then go to the same communities in which that data comes from and ask social workers and community groups to talk about and to process our research methods, to talk about how we're looking at the data and to get insight and approval from them on how we should be using this data.
That's interesting. I don't want to belabor this.
Sure.
Because there's a lot more that has come out of your works. One of the things that I was interested in is that the police are monitoring the Twitter accounts and the social media use by gang-involved youth. And one of the concerns that you had about that was that they often didn't understand what those communications meant. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. What I'm concerned about is our ability to understand when we're actually seeing a threat or not. And we have spent years trying to understand it. We've used multiple strategies, both artificial intelligence, qualitative analysis, and community members, and we still only get it right about 70% of the time. We've been doing it for 5 years. Yeah. And so we think that it's a complex problem. And so we are questioning whether or not the policing strategies using social media are actually using a more robust and comprehensive and contextual strategy for doing that. And here's the challenge. What we've seen is, with young kids of color, they're quick to surveil them on social media and to bring them in and to identify them. We've seen that happen in New York City, just a few blocks away, where there's a large gang bust of over 100 young black men that were identified through Facebook. And yet we have several examples of white mass murderers in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh and in Florida, in the yoga studio, of individuals leaving a long litany of scary posts online, and yet we only see it post hoc. Why is that?
So you're raising a question about whether this is a form of racial profiling?
A form of racial profiling, and I'm also questioning whether or not social media can be used as the new apparatus for mass incarceration.
Elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely. And so what I'm trying to really understand is, with the advent of social media and as it's used as evidence in the court system, could it be a new tool for identifying black and brown folks as criminals? And are we missing this particular tool because we're not focusing on social media as this new apparatus? And so I'm trying to investigate that a bit more.
Well, that's interesting. And just thinking about it from a sort of policy perspective, two kinds of answers. One is let's stop surveillance.
Right.
The other is let's surveil, if that's a word, everyone, no matter what their color is.
Right.
I don't know what your thinking is about
Right.
that.
Well, I think it comes down to the encoding and decoding of these social media posts. And the problem is that we're not equitably looking at everyone, and we're not viewing and interpreting their posts in the same way. So I'm not sure that we have the capacity to actually, if we looked at everyone, are we using the same lens, the same framework to interpret and understand those posts? And that's where I'm unclear.
Well, it's an interesting kind of problem. We have a question.
Okay.
I'm going to look at the screen
Okay.
now. Oh, it's not a question. It's advice to me that I'm not speaking loudly enough. So, if we were a really fancy operation, I'd have a thing in my ear,
Sure.
and they would be giving me that coaching that way. So where did we leave off? I thought we had a question to move to. So there's a really important issue about the use of surveillance in this country. You're looking at it in relationship to gang-involved youth, but there's a whole big question out there about the use of it to try to identify terrorists, the extent to which there's a predisposition to believe that it's going to be Muslim terrorists rather than, say, white nationalist
Sure.
terrorists. There's data out there now to suggest that white terrorism has been more common in the United States than other forms of terrorism.
Sure.
So it strikes me that it's a kind of general problem that we're facing because we have this social media capacity, or this capacity to surveil social media.
Absolutely. And so we have done some comparisons between gang-involved youth Twitter use and also ISIS use of Twitter as well through a DARPA grant that we were awarded last year. And one of the things we noticed is that there are some important distinctions in terms of when we see ISIS use of Twitter, it's more in the lines of propaganda and being very clear about a message and kind of executing that message over and over again and doing whatever it takes to get that message out. Versus within the communities that we work in, it's really about expressing everyday life. These young people are talking about everything: love and happiness and pain and trauma, girlfriends, boyfriends, everything. And that the context in which they are embedded in comes through as well. And so if they are experiencing high rates of violence, they will also talk about those things online as well. So we do see some real important distinctions there.
That's very interesting. The youth that you're looking at are, as you say, expressing more personal kinds of concerns. I would think that the violence is in some way also more personal.
It's all personal. And what became very clear to me is that social media is being used as a pro-social tool for coping with the array of things that are happening in a young person's life.
Yeah. I do have a question this time. I have two questions this time. Look at this. Someone would like to hear more about when to intervene based on social media posts.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think a really complicated question as well. I think that it's important to treat social media as an ecological context, meaning that you really need to listen and observe and understand the context before you just jump in and start trying to intervene in a particular post. And so I would say that I think that it's probably the first step is to really kind of treat this space as an ecological space and to listen and to also talk with clients and community members about their social media posts. And then once you learn from them, then you can start to think about those events, those triggering moments that oftentimes show up in social media space, and to listen to those events, to observe those events, and then follow those events over time as well.
Do you think that this should be included in the clinical process in some way? We train a lot of clinical social workers here, obviously. And you've said that you're working with social workers in Chicago, and here you're saying that social media can be useful in some way to the clinical process.
Yes. I think that we need to include social media in terms of social assessments. We need to include it in a clinical interview. It should be a part of the conversation that you're having with the client.
And maybe have access to social media with permission from the client.
I think that that's a discussion. So I think that at times that might be true, but also you can learn a lot from just a discussion around someone's social media use as well.
That's really interesting. How can we in the community support your work?
Well, we are always looking for volunteers. What's central to our work is to make sure that we are working with young people and community members to translate and interpret this data as well, to make sure that we are having the correct interpretation, but also think about the implications of the work. And we value those inputs and those insights from folks. And so that is an important piece. We're always fundraising, so getting the word out about this work is really helpful as well.
Is there some way that people can contribute money to your
Absolutely, we have.
Well, let's go.
We
We'll make this Giving Wednesday.
absolutely,
Giving Tuesday yesterday.
but you can
We're a day
also
late.
follow the Research Lab on Twitter, on Facebook. It's Safe Lab, and also on Twitter is Safe Lab as well.
And there's a way to donate if they do that.
Absolutely, we will have a link for you to figure out ways to donate as well.
So one person is asking a question that suggests that there are some positive aspects to social media, and of course there are some dangers and risks, but there are some positive aspects, and wanted you to comment on
Yeah,
that.
this is a great question. Thanks for asking this. And, actually, I have been transformed through Kyra Barnes' Twitter feed. And what I learned is that I was missing all of the humanistic qualities of her posts and the things that she was telling us that actually could have been used to prevent trauma. One of the things that we've been thinking about is identifying all of the strengths that people are posting online. What are the good things they're doing online? What are the positive, pro-social ways in which they are engaging social media? And can we identify those posts using artificial intelligence and then get that information to a social worker so that they can then build and enhance on those pro-social activities that are occurring in the online space?
And the person who asked that question was specifically concerned about how social media could be used to deal with some of the issues of social justice that you have been talking about.
Absolutely.
Some thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, what's clear is that young people are engaged in a variety of conversations, and social justice is a major part of their concerns. They're talking about their city, local politics, how they're viewing themselves vis-a-vis how society views them. All of these things are just sitting online, and we're never using it to actually support young people, and we're never surfacing those narratives in a way to actually humanize this population.
It just occurred to me as you were saying that getting the vote out in this country is a really big issue. I hadn't thought before, not that I do this kind of work, but I hadn't thought before about the fact that some of the gang-involved youth and people from some very troubled areas of the country are actually using social media regularly. Could we use that to generate a vote, do you think?
Absolutely, and I think that gang-involved youth are voting. I think that folks from these communities are engaged just the way in which everyone else is engaged as well. And so I think that what we're not seeing is tapping into those voices that are online. We're not privileging or centering that communication. So absolutely.
That really is interesting. I do watch TV, I confess. And I don't know that I have ever seen a gang-involved youth interviewed on any kind of cable news or any other kind of news show about their political opinions.
Right. Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's a good point.
Let's get the School of Journalism involved in this as well.
Absolutely.
Let them go out and talk to people. That
Absolutely.
would be really interesting, I think. Are there plans to create courses or a curriculum in which social media is linked to social work in the school?
Absolutely. So with my colleague Courtney Cogburn and Tara Batista, we are working to develop a new technology track here at Columbia Social Work. We are proposing 3 new courses that focus on technology literacy and data science for social good. And so hopefully within the next year, we will have either a new track or minor in technology here at Columbia Social Work.
And as you can see, the person asking this question wants to know how they can get involved in the conversation about what's happening at the school in relation to this.
Absolutely. Come up to the Safe Lab. We're in room 1101 on the 11th floor. And then also follow us on social media. And email me as well. We're always welcoming ideas and conversations and ways to get involved.
And you said you had ways to use volunteers as well.
Absolutely. So just stop by and we can figure those things out together.
Let me ask a somewhat different question. Tell me not to ask it if I shouldn't, but there's a lot of concern about the impact of social media on children and the next generation. I grew up without television, and then there was this whole concern that TV would destroy our minds. But now there's a similar kind of concern out there about social media. You have any perspective on that, position on that?
I think it's really complex, and I think a part of the challenge is that we have spent so much time only looking at the negative aspects of social media. And I think those things are true. We are seeing bullying and what I call internet or cyberbanging. We're seeing suicidal ideation. All of those things do exist, are problematic, and need attention as well. But I would say those things are small in comparison to a lot of the great things that young people are doing online. And yet, for some reason, we don't talk about those positive things and are not redirecting young people in ways to help support their strengths and to get them support offline as well. What I've learned from observing and listening to young people online is that they want people to talk to. They want someone to listen. They want to be vulnerable. They want help. They want to reach adults. And online allows for a space to really kind of be themselves. A multiplicity of selves. Your school self, your most idealized self, your challenged self. All those things show up online. And yet, how do we help to move that to an offline space as well?
I'm just wondering, from what you're saying, and I certainly agree, I think social media has a lot to offer in terms of helping people to build and maintain relationships. I'm wondering whether it can be used to sort of get outside of one's own community and to connect with other communities.
100%, and we're already seeing that. I mean, young people are brilliant, and they are connecting with people not only in their communities, but in different countries and different spaces. They're connecting with people who have different identities and different social positionalities. We see that happen all the time. And so it's not something necessarily that needs to be kind of, pushed upon. It's something that we need to encourage.
Do you see that among gang-involved youth, that they're communicating outside of their gang, as it were? We're talking these days in the United States all the time about the tribal quality of the United States these days.
Of course. And I think what's important to remember is that gang-involved youth are like other youth. There really is no distinction. There's just a different context. And so absolutely the folks that I observe are connecting with people that are outside of their traditional networks. Mm-hmm. They're doing a lot of different things. They're not just talking about their gangs. They're talking about family and school and love. And they're talking about Chicago. They're critiquing the politics of Chicago. They're critiquing the news. They're critiquing how people view them as individuals, as actors in this society. So there's a lot happening.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Another question. Does this work relate in any way to the work being done on social media and suicidal youth?
So we have not focused on suicidal youth in our research, but absolutely a lot of the same. I think the context and the language is something that we focus on a lot, and I think it's a very similar approach to looking at a suicidal ideation that shows up in digital space as well.
I'm sure, as this questioner knows, but it's worth saying that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is doing a lot of work to try to use social media to connect with people who are at suicide
Absolutely.
risk, people who have fears and concerns for themselves. So there's a way to connect with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline around that concern. Here's a stunning question. I can't believe the first sentence. Twitter won't last forever. I mean, is that true?
Yeah.
Is that true? What is it going to be replaced by? All right, what are the upcoming trends in social media? How can social workers prepare for the next generation of social media? Okay, you're now a prophet.
Yeah, well, I'm going to prophesy and say that I think that this is why it's important to always take a human-centered approach to this work and listening to young people. What platforms are they using? What's coming down the pike? I would definitely say that I think virtual reality is the next wave of the future, and that I would think that social media will probably morph. We will probably be connecting more closely through virtual reality as well.
What does that mean, virtual reality?
You put on the headset and you get to experience a new world, a new experience, and it is a virtual space that is developed.
So communicating with people with characters on a screen, we're going to have a sense of actually being in the presence.
So perhaps, you and I could be on the beach having this conversation and our avatars show up and have the exact same conversation. That would be a virtual reality experience.
I like the idea of being on
I
the
know,
beach,
right?
Let's plan that. We're running out of time, but we have one last question here. How can an individual gain cultural competency regarding the social media, languages, culture? That's an interesting question. You've done a lot of work on how to figure out what various tweets mean, because there's a different language out there.
Yeah, this is a great question. One of the things we're working on is to develop a set of game simulations. And what we're trying to do is, with our colleagues at MIT, we're creating simulations of Instagram and Facebook so that individuals can actually practice different ways of being online, different ways of interpreting posts online as well. What we know is that the speed of communication on social media happens really quickly, and we oftentimes don't have enough time to actually pause and think about our posts. And so we're hoping to create some simulations that give individuals opportunity to pause, and we would love to incorporate this in some of the new classroom experiences that we're hoping to design as well.
Well, speaking about not having enough time, we don't have enough time. We're out of it. I want to thank you, Desmond Patton, for joining us today. It's been terrific meeting you and talking with you. I want to thank those of you who are watching us, and hope that you'll come back again next week at 12 o'clock when we will have another member of our community that we'll talk with. Thank you.